Evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Tonight, May 6, 2025, we're cutting through the noise. No endless scrolling, just a focused news briefing on India.
Exactly. Think of this as your essential download. We sifted through the day's headlines, looked at the connections, and we're here to give you the key insights across some vital areas.
Absolutely. We've got quite a range tonight from the climax of the IPL season, which is always exciting, to some really crucial policy debates, national security stuff, and even what's happening in India's AI labs.
So let's just jump right in.
Let's do it. First up, cricket. The headline says, IPL playoff race tightens. Sounds like things are getting intense.
Oh, definitely. We're nearing the end of the group stage in the Indian Premier League, and the
Doesn't
competition for those top four playoff spots is, well, it's incredibly fierce right now.
It's fierce is right. I saw that 7 teams are actually still in the running.
7 teams, yeah. And what really makes it dramatic is how close the top five are, just 2 points separating them. It's nail-biting stuff.
So some teams are already out, I gather.
That's right. We know Sunrisers Hyderabad, Rajasthan Royals, and Chennai Super Kings won't be making the playoffs this year. But for everyone else still in it, the stakes are massive.
Okay, maybe quickly remind us, how does qualification work again?
Sure. So each team plays 14 group matches. You get 2 points for a win. Pretty straightforward. The 4 teams with the most points at the end, they go through to the playoffs.
Got it. And Royal Challengers Bengaluru are leading the pack.
They are, yeah. Sitting pretty on 16 points from 11 games. If they win 2 of their remaining 3 matches, they're guaranteed a spot.
But it's not quite locked yet.
Not quite. Because it's so tight, even getting one more win, finishing on, say, 18 points might not be enough. It could come down to net run rate or how other teams perform. It's complicated.
Wow. And Punjab Kings are right behind them.
Yep, Punjab Kings are on 15 points, also from 11 matches. Their situation is very similar to Bengaluru's. 2 more wins guarantees qualification.
But one win leaves it uncertain.
Exactly. Leaves them relying on other results going their way. It just shows, every single run, every wicket in these last few matches could be the difference. Super competitive finish this year.
Okay, let's shift gears completely. Our next headline touches on something fundamental. Fragmented caste data hinders equitable policies. This sounds like a deep-rooted challenge.
It really is, and it affects policymaking across the board. The core issue, historically speaking, is that the last proper, full, nationwide caste census was conducted way back in 1931.
1931?
Seriously.
Seriously, nearly a century ago. There was an attempt in 2011, the socioeconomic and caste census, but it was reportedly quite flawed, and the data was never officially released or used for policy.
So policies today are based on much broader categories, like
Yeah.
SC, ST, OBC.
Precisely. And the problem with these broad categories, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, other backward classes, is that they mask huge differences within those groups.
Can you give an example? Sure. Take the OBC category. You have groups like, say, Yadavs or Jats, who've gained significant political and social clout over the years. But then you also have many, many other OBC groups within that same label who remain quite marginalized. Lumping them all together for policy doesn't work.
And that impacts how things like welfare benefits are distributed, right?
Absolutely. If policies are designed using these generic classifications, the benefits often tend to flow towards the more organized, more politically powerful subgroups. The most vulnerable within those categories can easily get left behind.
The headline also mentioned land ownership inequality. What did the stats show there?
Yeah, that was stark. Scheduled caste families make up about 16% of India's population, but they own only around 7.2% of the agricultural land. That's a huge gap. And even that figure doesn't tell us about the distribution within the SE community.
And it's not just about caste in isolation, is it? It intersects with other things.
Exactly. Caste always intersects with class, with gender, with where someone lives, urban versus rural, north versus south. The challenges faced by, say, a Dalit woman in a village in Bihar are vastly different from those of a middle-class OBC man in Bangalore. Our policies often struggle to capture that complexity.
Which means even things like reservation policies might be based on outdated numbers.
That's a major concern. They're still using population estimates that are decades old. Plus, the newer EWS quota, the one for economically weaker sections, that completely bypasses caste-based historical disadvantage.
From a political strategy perspective, this lack of data must make things difficult too.
Definitely. National political strategies often have to rely on assumptions or regional estimations. You do see some states trying to fix this, like Bihar conducted its own survey recently, which is useful locally, but it doesn't solve the national data gap.
So the argument is for a better, more comprehensive national survey.
Yes, the call is for a national survey that doesn't just count castes, but actually documents living conditions, things like jobs, land ownership, education levels, healthcare access broken down by specific community. That's seen as the way to get fairer, more targeted policies.
But isn't there a worry that collecting this data could just deepen divisions?
That's always the counterargument, and it's a valid concern. People worry it could reinforce identities. But, the other side says that not collecting the data, pretending these inequalities don't exist or aren't linked to caste, just allows them to persist. The argument is you need the data to actually address the problem effectively.
Okay, moving on to the economy. Some positive news here. Urban India's financial awareness surges. What's behind this?
Yeah, this is based on a recent survey showing quite a significant shift. The headline finding is that life insurance ownership among urban Indians has hit an all-time high 78%.
78%, that's pretty high. There was also mention of a protection quotient.
Right. The protection quotient is basically a measure of how financially prepared people feel. That's jumped up to 48 from 35 back in 2019. And overall financial security in urban areas is back up to 68%, which is actually higher than pre-pandemic levels.
So people are feeling more secure, and they seem to understand insurance better, too.
Looks like it. The survey's knowledge index, specifically about life insurance, has also increased, hitting 63. So awareness and understanding seem to be growing together.
And interestingly, people are prioritizing coverage over costs now.
That's a really key shift. Apparently, 75% of urban Indians surveyed said getting enough protection from their term insurance is now more important than just finding the cheapest premium. That suggests a deeper understanding of risk management, long-term thinking.
Do you think the pandemic experience played a role here?
It seems very likely, doesn't it? The uncertainty and, frankly, the losses many faced probably made people think much harder about financial safety nets and long-term planning.
What does this mean for the insurance companies then?
Well, it suggests they might need to focus more on education, explaining the value of adequate coverage and making sure products are really accessible. It's a good sign for the industry, though a more aware customer base is usually a growing market.
So overall, a positive trend in financial literacy and behavior in urban India.
Yeah, definitely seems that way. The rising protection quotient indicates a positive shift, a growing recognition that life insurance is a really important tool for financial security.
Let's turn to the environment now. Headline: Forest Rights Act and Biodiversity Conservation. This connects indigenous rights with protecting nature.
It does, and it's crucial to understand the history here. For a long time, conservation in India, like in many places, followed a kind of fortress conservation model, meaning indigenous peoples and local communities, IPLCs, were often seen as, encroachers or threats to the forest, rather than stewards. This led to displacement and ignored their traditional knowledge and rights.
But India also has international commitments, right? Like the Convention on Biological Diversity.
Yes, India is a signatory to the CBD and passed its own Biological Diversity Act back in 2002. But there was still often a gap between those high-level goals and respecting the rights of people living in and depending on the forests.
So the Forest Rights Act, the FRA, passed in 2006, was a major turning point.
A huge turning point. The FRA explicitly recognized the rights of forest-dwelling communities over forest resources. It linked conservation directly to community rights and governance, empowering local village councils, the Gram Sabhas.
And IPLCs have been pushing for this kind of recognition internationally, too.
Absolutely. They've been very vocal at UN conventions. Article AHA of the CBD specifically talks about preserving indigenous knowledge, though, progress on actually implementing that has been pretty slow globally.
There's also this 30 by 30 target making headlines globally.
Right. That's from the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. The goal is to protect 30% of the planet's land and sea by 2030. It's ambitious, but there's a real risk, flagged by many groups, that achieving this could lead to more displacement of IPLCs if their rights aren't central to the process.
How does India's national strategy fit in with the FRA and this 30 by 30 goal?
Well, India's updated its national biodiversity strategy. It does talk more about community involvement, which is good, but critics say it still tends to favor state-controlled conservation models.
So the FRA offers a different path.
It offers a more inclusive path, yes.
Right.
It already provides a legal framework for recognizing IPLC's rights to protect and manage forests themselves. The argument is that really integrating FRA principles into all conservation efforts is key for making them fair and effective.
So, respecting rights isn't just social justice, it's actually better for conservation.
That's increasingly the consensus among experts, yeah. When communities have secure rights and a stake in management, conservation outcomes tend to be better and more sustainable. It's about equitable partnership.
Okay, let's move to trade. Headline 5. India grapples with influx of cheap Chinese imports. This sounds like a familiar story for many countries.
It is, and it's hitting certain Indian industries quite hard. The example given is viscose yarn production, part of the textile sector. Local manufacturers are really struggling to compete on price with cheaper Chinese imports, and it's causing production slowdowns.
Why the influx now? Is there a specific reason?
A major factor seems to be the U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods. With the U.S. market becoming more difficult, Chinese manufacturers are looking for other large markets, like India, to sell their products. China says they're against dumping, but the pressure on Indian firms is real.
Has India taken any steps to counter this?
Well, they have put a 12% tax on some types of steel imports, for instance. But the bigger picture is India is still very reliant on Chinese imports overall, especially for intermediate goods components needed for manufacturing here. That's led to this massive trade deficit, around $100 billion now, with China.
There's a kind of paradox here, isn't there? India's industrial growth seems to be fueling these imports.
That's an interesting point some analysts make. Yes, India's manufacturing is growing, even with companies like Apple assembling more here. But often, that assembly relies heavily on imported components, many from China. So growth in one area can actually increase dependence in another.
What's the government doing about it?
They've set up committees to monitor imports more closely and investigate any unfair practices like dumping. But the longer-term view from analysts is that India really needs to boost its own competitiveness across the board to reduce this reliance.
And the current global situation might offer an opportunity.
Possibly. With more global scrutiny on China's trade practices, there might be leverage for India to negotiate better terms, push back against unfair competition, and really double down on strengthening its own domestic industries.
Right. Shifting focus now to regional geopolitics and economics. Headline 6. Moody's warns of economic impact on Pakistan from prolonged India tensions.
Yeah, this analysis from Moody's, the ratings agency, is quite stark. They're warning that prolonged tensions with India could seriously hurt Pakistan's economy, impacting growth, its government finances, and especially its ability to get financing from abroad.
Why is Pakistan seen as particularly vulnerable?
Well, its economic fundamentals are already quite weak. It's heavily reliant on IMF bailouts and financial support from other countries. Moody's points out that while there have been some recent improvements, growth picking up a bit, inflation coming down, persistent tensions could easily reverse that progress.
And its credit rating reflects this vulnerability.
It does. Pakistan has a speculative, or junk, credit rating. It depends heavily on rolling over debt from allies like Saudi Arabia, China, and the UAE. You even saw the stock market, the KSE 100 index, react negatively to recent geopolitical worries.
How does Moody's see the impact on India's economy? In contrast,
They expect India's economy to remain much more stable. Strong public investment, solid private consumption, these are seen as key buffers. Plus, frankly, India's direct economic ties with Pakistan are minimal.
how minimal?
Trade with Pakistan was less than 0.5% of India's total exports last year. So even if that trade were disrupted, the overall impact on India's economy would likely be very small.
Although higher defense spending could be a factor for India.
That's a fair point. If tensions lead to significantly increased defense budgets, that could potentially impact India's fiscal consolidation plans down the line. It's something to watch.
So Moody's isn't predicting a major conflict, but sees Pakistan as more economically exposed.
Exactly. They acknowledge the risk of periodic flare-ups, but don't expect a full-blown war. The key takeaway is India's economic resilience versus Pakistan's greater vulnerability due to its reliance on external support.
Following directly on from that, our next headline. India orders civil defense mock drills amid Pakistan tensions. This seems like a direct response to the current situation.
It certainly looks that way. The Indian Home Ministry ordering these drills across 244 districts, that's quite widespread. It's explicitly linked to the rising tensions, especially after that recent terrorist attack in Pahalgam. The goal is clearly citizen preparedness.
What kind of things will these drills practice?
They're focusing on the essentials for civilian safety during a potential attack. Testing air raid warning systems, practicing blackout procedures to reduce visibility, and running through evacuation plans for vulnerable areas.
So testing sirens, communication links.
Yes, making sure sirens work, checking communication lines with the Air Force for warnings, rehearsing how to get people out of harm's way safely. They're also emphasizing readiness down to the village level and even talking about camouflaging important infrastructure like industrial plants.
Sounds quite comprehensive.
It aims to be. The drills will also assess how well the local emergency control rooms function and, importantly, train ordinary civilians on what protective measures they should take if something happens. The advisory even mentioned the Houthi attack on Tel Aviv airport as a kind of global context for why this preparedness is needed.
And again, this happens against the backdrop of the economic assessment we just discussed that Pakistan is likely to suffer more economically from these tensions.
Right. While India is focusing here on bolstering its national security posture and civilian readiness, the economic analysis suggests the financial pain from the tensions is likely to be felt more acutely across the border. It underscores the government's focus on security.
Okay, another security-related headline, but this time in the digital space. Pakistani hackers escalate cyber attacks on Indian defense entities.
Yeah, this is concerning. The attacks are being attributed to a group calling itself the Pakistan Cyber Force, and they seem to be specifically targeting Indian defense organizations to get sensitive data.
Have they claimed any successful breaches?
They've claimed they breached systems belonging to the Military Engineering Services, MES, and the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses, MPIDSA. They also claim to have stolen personal info, like login details of personnel. Now, these claims are being investigated, but one confirmed incident was the defacement of the Armored Vehicles Nigam Limited, AVNL website.
What happened there?
The hackers put up Pakistani symbols, pictures of tanks, that sort of thing. The website was taken offline immediately for a security check to see how deep they got and to patch things up.
So Indian cybersecurity teams are actively working on this.
Oh, absolutely. They're monitoring networks, trying to block intrusions, and working to strengthen defenses across the board. It's an ongoing battle.
Does the surge seem linked to the recent physical attacks and tensions?
It certainly seems correlated, doesn't it? The timing, coming after the Pahalgam attack, suggests it might be part of a broader pattern of pressure. There are also attempts on some welfare and educational websites linked to the military, though those seem to have been blocked.
It just highlights how crucial digital security is becoming.
Totally. It reinforces the need for constant vigilance and proactive measures to protect critical national infrastructure and sensitive data from these kinds of cyber threats.
Let's turn to the legal front now. Headline 9. Supreme Court concerns over ED evidence in money laundering cases. What's the issue here?
The Supreme Court, specifically Justices Oka and Puyan, have voiced concern about a perceived pattern. They noted that the Enforcement Directorate, the ED, sometimes makes serious money laundering accusations without presenting clear, solid evidence linking the accused directly to the actual proceeds of crime.
And this came up in a specific case.
Yes, during a bail hearing for a man named Arvind Singh, who's accused in connection with that alleged Chhattisgarh liquor scam. The court basically asked the ED, where's the proof connecting him to this 40 crore you're talking about?
How did the ED respond?
Well, the additional Solicitor General argued Singh was part of a much larger scam, maybe 2,000 crore, and ran a parallel business. But the court pushed back, noting Singh didn't actually hold any official position in the company at the heart of the allegations, which weakens the direct link.
So the court is demanding a higher standard of proof.
It seems that way. They're stressing the need for concrete evidence, not just broad accusations. Interestingly, the ASG asked for more time to find evidence, and even mentioned he'd previously advised the ED to gather strong proof before making arrests.
And the defense argued for bail.
Naturally. Singh's lawyer pointed out he'd been in custody for 10 months already. The case files are huge, suggesting a long process ahead. The court also specifically pushed back against any idea that bail should only be considered after a year in jail.
What are the broader implications here?
Well, it puts a spotlight on the ED's investigation methods and the burden of proof in these high-profile money laundering cases. It reinforces the judiciary's role in ensuring that accusations are backed by substantial evidence before depriving someone of liberty.
Okay, shifting to diplomacy. Headline 10. India expresses concerns to Canada over pro-Khalistan rally. This seems to be an ongoing point of friction.
It is, and this particular incident in Toronto clearly crossed a line for India. Reports mention inflammatory slogans, very derogatory images of Indian leaders, including the Prime Minister, and even calls to expel Canadians of Indian origin.
And this is the first formal communication since Canada's new Prime Minister took office.
That's right. India conveyed its displeasure directly to the Canadian High Commission in Delhi. The message was clear. Take action against these extremist and separatist elements operating in Canada.
So this rally has definitely increased the tension.
No doubt about it. India has long been concerned about Khalistani separatist activities in Canada, and incidents like this just amplify those worries. India is making it clear it won't tolerate threats to its sovereignty or the safety of its diaspora.
All right, let's look at technology again. Headline 11, Indian academics explore deeper potential of AI. Sounds like a lot of interesting research is happening.
There really is, across many different institutions. It's not just theoretical stuff either. They're looking at practical applications, from optimizing computer chip efficiency to uses in industry and healthcare.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. IIC in Bangalore is integrating AI with computational physics. Manipal Institute of Technology got funding for using AI to help diagnose coronary artery disease. IIT Delhi is working on energy-efficient AI hardware and using AI for natural disaster forecasting with ISRO.
And it's not just the big IITs.
No. Delhi Technological University is tackling misinformation and hate speech detection, plus AI in farming and smart homes. IIT Hyderabad is doing great work in natural language processing, understanding Indian languages with their Haratgin model, and also in autonomous navigation, like driverless shuttles and drones.
That's impressive. But the headline hinted at a challenge, too. Something about industry involvement.
Yeah, that's a point raised by some experts. While the academic research is strong, India perhaps lags behind the U.S. and China when it comes to industry really partnering with academia and driving commercial applications of this research. There's a call for much stronger collaboration.
So bridging the gap between the lab and the market is key.
Exactly. Government initiatives are there, but they can sometimes take a long time to bear fruit. Stronger ties between universities, government, and private companies could really accelerate AI development and help India become a true global player in the field.
Okay, back to the economy one more time. Headline 12. Retail investors stabilizing Indian stock markets. Finance Minister. That's an interesting perspective.
It is. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman made this point at the Asian Development Bank meeting. She argued that the growing participation of ordinary Indian retail investors is actually making the stock market less volatile. They're acting as a kind of counterweight to foreign portfolio investors. Well, apparently, since around 2020, Indian retail investors have shown a greater willingness to take risks and invest. This flow of domestic money helps support share prices when foreign investors might be selling, and it also provides capital for Indian companies to grow. Adds resilience.
The finance minister also mentioned broader economic trends.
Yes. She reiterated that strong domestic demand is still the main driver of India's overall economic growth. She also touched on a shift in foreign policy, suggesting India is focusing more on bilateral deals rather than relying solely on multilateral bodies like the UN or WTO.
And she met with the ADB chief.
Right. Discussed India potentially being a testing ground for new, innovative financing models that the ADB could pilot.
So the overall message is one of increasing domestic strength and self-reliance.
Pretty much. More stable markets, thanks to local investors, growth driven from within, and a more assertive, perhaps selective approach to international engagement. It paints a picture of an evolving Indian financial landscape.
Almost there. Headline 13. India proposes zero tariffs to U.S. in trade negotiations. This sounds potentially significant.
Very significant, potentially. India has apparently put a zero-for-zero tariff deal on the table for specific sectors: steel, auto parts, and pharmaceuticals. Basically, India eliminates its tariffs if the U.S. does the same.
But there are conditions.
Yes. Crucially, it depends on U.S. reciprocity. And there's talk of setting limits on import volumes. It's not just wide-open free trade.
And this is happening during that 90-day tariff pause President Trump announced.
Exactly. It's a window for negotiation, not just with India, but other Asian nations too. India seems keen to get some kind of bilateral deal done by the autumn, following a recent visit to Washington.
What about those import limits?
The idea seems to be if U.S. imports in these sectors go above an agreed threshold, then India's standard tariffs would kick back in. It's a way to get the benefits of lower tariffs while still protecting domestic industry from a sudden flood of imports.
The U.S. has its own concerns, though, right, about India's quality control orders.
Yes, the QCOs. The U.S. argues these standards can be barriers to trade, lacking transparency or fairness, making it hard for U.S. goods, especially things like medical devices and chemicals, to enter the Indian market.
How is India responding to that?
India says it's willing to review the QCOs in those specific sectors, and they've also proposed a mutual recognition agreement where each country accepts the other standards as equivalent, which could streamline things.
And the U.S. economy contracting might add some urgency.
Could do. A slowing U.S. economy might make trade deals more attractive for them. President Trump has also hinted multiple deals might be coming. So India is trying to get favorable terms while addressing U.S. concerns. A lot riding on these talks for both sides.
Okay, final headline. Number 14. India rapidly expands solar manufacturing to reduce China reliance. A big push for energy security here.
A huge push. The numbers are quite dramatic. Just in the year between March 2024 and March 2025, India apparently nearly tripled its solar cell manufacturing capacity to 25 gigawatts and almost doubled its solar module capacity to 74 gigawatts.
Wow. What's driving that kind of growth?
It's largely government policy, things like financial incentives under the Production-Linked Incentive (PLI) scheme, import duties on finished panels and cells to encourage local production, and upcoming rules mandating local sourcing for government projects. They're really trying to build a domestic industry.
But we still import a lot.
Oh yeah. Despite the growth, India still imports something like 80% of its solar equipment needs, and China is still the biggest supplier by far, providing over 60% of those imports, especially the upstream stuff like wafers and polysilicon.
So that dependence creates risks.
Definitely. Supply chain disruptions, price swings, geopolitical issues, especially concerning polysilicon production in Xinjiang. It's a vulnerability India wants to reduce.
Is Indian-made solar equipment competitive on cost yet?
Getting closer, but not quite there. Domestic modules are still about 10% more expensive than imports, mainly due to higher raw material costs and smaller scale compared to China's massive factories.
So the goal is self-sufficiency, but there's still work to do.
Exactly. India has that massive target, 500 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. Achieving that, while also becoming self-reliant in manufacturing, needs continued policy support, technological innovation to bring costs down, and maybe strategic partnerships. It's a major undertaking.
Well, that certainly wraps up a very eventful news day in India. We've gone from the IPL finals race through complex issues like caste data and forest rights, looked at economic shifts, financial awareness, trade negotiations.
Geopolitical tensions, cybersecurity threats, legal developments, AI research, and that big push in solar manufacturing. It really covers a lot of ground.
It does, and looking at these headlines together, you really get a sense of the different forces shaping India right now. The economic pressures, the social dynamics, the security concerns, the technological ambitions.
Absolutely. They're all interconnected in intricate ways, aren't they?
Yeah, they really are. Which leads to a final thought for you to ponder. Considering everything we've discussed, trade influencing manufacturing, tensions affecting stability and preparedness, technology offering solutions, if you had to pick one single factor, what do you think will most significantly shape India's path in the immediate future? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.